not going to have crook of the week again. I love crook of the week. Crook of the week. Okay, we are live. So let's get started. Yesterday, we learned a very mechudesh bit of the Gemara. We learned the sugya of Tumas HaTahayim. We learned phase 1 of Tumas HaTahayim, and today we're going to learn phase 2. I'm just going to briefly review what we learned yesterday about Tumas HaTahayim, and the rest of what we learned yesterday. But the first part of today's Gemara is on a tangent that has nothing whatsoever to do with Nazir nor with Tumas HaTahayim. It's a completely new halacha, nothing to do with anything. That's going to be the first amud of today's blot, and then the second amud is going to go more into Tumas HaTahayim, and we'll elaborate on what we learned yesterday. So what we learned yesterday about Tumas HaTahayim is we learned that there's this new phenomena that's a halacha l'moshe Sinai, so there's no logic or rhyme or reason for its parameters and how it works. But the rules are as follows. First of all, the first ground rule we need to know about Tumas HaTahayim is if you come in contact with Tumas HaTahayim, you're tamei. There's no one who says you're not tamei. The question is, does the tumah that you get from Tumas HaTahayim, will it be mevatel your naziris and force the whole process of cleansing yourself from a naziris to tumah? A. And B is, if that happened to someone who wanted to bring a korban pesach, will it prevent him from bringing the korban pesach? But tamei he surely is. So the first piece of information is that this halacha l'moshe Sinai of Tumas HaTahayim is only related to Hilchas Nazir and Hilchas Korban Pesach. The Mishnah clarified for us what exactly is a Tumas HaTahayim. And the Mishnah says that it's a tumah that no one ever saw, but that needs to be clarified further, because someone must know that this fellow was buried because someone buried him. So what we learned is that Tumas HaTahayim, sure, at one point someone knew that he was buried, but nowadays, today, right now, when this tumah is occurring, no one in the world is aware of this mess, this tumah being buried there. And we learned as follows, that this is only relevant by Nazir if he was already Migalayach. So the story was that the Nazir completed his Naziris successfully, and he brought his karbanis, and he took his haircut, and he's about to dig into his wine and become a regular citizen, where his friend walks over to him and tells him, whoa, you can't be a Nazir who completed his Naziris successfully, because last week did you not take Route 6? And right after you took Route 6, they did an excavation there on that site, and it was full of mason. So retroactively, your Naziris is done. That's where it's relevant. Because if you go over a Tumas HaTahayim and you find out about it right away, or before you finish your Naziris, Tumas HaTahayim doesn't save you from that. Tumas HaTahayim only saves you if you're already completely finished with a successful term of Naziris. And then you found out that in the past, you became tamei through Tumas HaTahayim. There we don't say it undoes what has already been completed. That is the chiddush of Tumas HaTahayim related to Nazir. We learned another Yosy, but before I get to the other Yosy, it's the parallel. The parallel is by Korban Pesach, as well. If you walked over a Tumas HaTahayim and then you found out there's a Tumas HaTahayim there, you cannot bring your Korban Pesach. If you already brought your Korban Pesach thinking that you're your Torah, so you're there Pesach afternoon, Erev Pesach afternoon, all excited with your carbon that you're going to roast tonight and eat, and your friend tells me, Yankel, you have a Korban Pesach? How could you have a Korban Pesach? Didn't you take Route 6? And everybody knows that Route 6 there's an excavation the next day, and you're tamei. So once again, if you're already holding after the fact, Tumas HaTahayim says that we don't retroactively make you tamei and undo it. But avada, before you brought your korban pesach, if you were on a Tumas HaTahayim, avada you're tamei, avada you couldn't bring the korban pesach. So those are some of the rules of Tumas HaTahayim. It does not prevent you from being tamei, but the halacha l'Moshe Messinai is that it won't retroactively mess you up if you've already completed your Naziris, and it won't retroactively mess you up if you've already brought your carbon. When I say mess you up, I mean mem suf you up, right? Now, that's item number one. The other item we need to know is that there's another caveat when it comes to Tumas HaTayim, and that is, it only works if you weren't Tamei to begin with. But if you were Tamei to begin with, and you're trying to be Mitayar yourself, so you have a Cheskas Tumah, again, Tumas HaTayim won't save you from that. However, if you were Tar, and you went over a Tumas HaTayim, that's when the properties of Tumas HaTayim would help you. So the example that the Mishnah gave you was if you went swimming in the mikveh to cool off, but you were Tar, you didn't need any type of tahira, there you have Tumas HaTayim. That will save you. But if you were Tamei and you were toiveling, meaning you were a Tamei Meis, and you had your Hazav Shlishi, you had your Hazav Shvi, and now you're toiveling, and they found the mace there, you have a Cheskas Tumah, there Tumas HaTayim will not rescue you. Okay, that's what we learned in our Mishnah yesterday, and we brought Psukim to learn it. We tried with Psukim, and the Gemara ended up coming out that it was a halacha l'Moshe Messinai. Gewaltig. Then we had the discussion of Rami Bar Chama. When you look at someone being Tamei, what is the date where we register as Tumah? Is it the date that he became Tamei, or is it the date that he found out that he was Tamei? Now, if you became Tamei la'acher malois, according to Rabbi Nazir, you only have to wait 7 days, not 30 days. So therefore, his shaila is, if you found out after malois that you became Tamei, would you wait 7 days or 30 days? And the Gemara came out from our Mishnah that it's 7 days. Then we had the shaila of a mace who was spread across the width of a road, and it would have been impossible to walk down that road without being mal or having come in contact with the mace. And the Gemara tells us that that's for sure tamei. However, if the mace was in pieces where it was possible we could have walked through the raindrops and not come into contact with it, then you'll say Safek Tamei B'Shus HaRabim Sveikei Tahar. That took us to the end of yesterday's Gemara. Now, if you remember, when the Mishnah was giving us examples of where you say Tumas HaTayim and where not, the Mishnah gave us an example of a guy who went to the mikveh and there was mace, a kazayis from mace floating around. So it was what we call a floating tumah. Because of that, the Gemara goes off into a tangent because there's a whole new halacha about floating tumas. And the halacha is, and we'll see as the Gemara unfolds, that this only applies to tumas maga. If there's a tumah floating, and you're not sure if you touched that tumah, so you were in a swimming pool and you found out afterwards that there was a piece of sheret, piece of nevela, even a piece of mace floating around, and you don't know if you touched it or not. So it's a suffix. The halacha is you go to kula. This also sounds like a halacha l'Moshe Messinai type of halacha, but in fact we're going to see that we learned out of psukim. So it's a whole new halacha that floating tumas, if it's a suffix maga, floating tumas, if it's a suffix maga, it's a suffix if you touched it or not, even though you might normally go to chumrah, if it was b'shus hayachid, suffix tamei b'shus hayachid tvekei tamei, if it's floating, the Torah tells us that you assume it's not tamei. The big chiddush. Now, under what circumstances do you say floating? There's rules and regulations as to what's called floating, and there'll be machlokes about it, but that's the general rule. Floating tumah, if you touch it for sure, you're tamei. But floating tumah that we have a suffix if you touched it, there you will not be tamei. Or if it was Taharis that touched it, the Taharis will not become tamei if it's a suffix if they touched. So let's have a look at the Gemara at the bottom of Daf Samach Ribul Amud Beis. Since the Mishnah mentioned floating tumah, the Gemara goes off on a tangent to analyze the halacha floating tumah. But of course, this is not relevant at all to Nazir, nor is it relevant to Tumas HaTayim. But it's an opportunity to learn a new type of halacha by tumah.
Mm-hmm.
So at the bottom of the Samach Gimel and Beis, Ketzad Yorad. The Nazir went into the mikveh. Zok to Gemara, Safa Eina Metama Le'inyan Sheretz. When you're talking about Tumah Sheretz, if it's a floating Tumah and there's a suffix, you say it's not going to be Tumah. Right? That is the rule of floating Tumah. The Tanya we learned. Suffix Tumah Tzafa. You have a suffix about a Tumah that was floating. You have a suffix if you touched it or not. Bein B'Kalim, it doesn't matter if you had a piece of Tumah that was floating in a bathtub, in a pail, Bein B'Karka, or if it was floating in a bar, in a river, in a lake, in an ocean, in a puddle, it will be tahar. If it's floating, it's tahar. That is the shita of the Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon says no, it doesn't apply everywhere. The kalim tameya. If you have a piece of tumah floating around in a keli, that's not covered by the rule of suffix floating. But the karka this rule that if it's a suffix, if you touch the floating tumah, you go to kula, you say your tar, that's only if it was floating in a puddle of water that's on the ground, not if it's in a keli. So that is the machlokes that we have. Zok to Gemara, my time in the Tanakh. And this is how we know it's not halacha l'Moshe Sinai, because we're going to see that they each darshan psukim differently to get this information. So if they're darshaning from psukim, it's obviously not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. My time the Tanakh. What is the reasoning for the Tanakh? Why does the Tanakh say that a floating tumah, no matter what? Why is it that the Gemara says that a floating tumah, no matter what, will be, if it's a suffix, it's tar? Ksivit says as follows. It says, B'chol hasheretz hashoyretz. It's talking about tumah sheretz. And the pasuk tells us, it says, Al teshaktu es nafshosechem b'chol hasheretz hashoyretz. Any sheretz. In other words, we're darshaning, it's not speaking about tumah over here, but every type of sheretz is going to be tamei. Meaning, it doesn't matter if it's floating, if it's not floating, every single type of tumah is tamei. And then it says, then it says the tumah is only by a sheretz asheretz al haaretz. So we have what seems to be an inconsistency in the psukim. One pasuk seems to be mashma, that a sheretz in any shape or form is going to be metama. And the other pasuk seems to say, it's only if it's sheretz al haaretz. Ha-ketzad, how can we combine these two psukim? The teretz is, vade magoi tamei. The pasuk that says b'chala sheretz hashoyretz, any type of tumah sheretz or tamei, that's speaking if you know for sure you touched it. But savak magai tar, the pasuk that says the dafka la'aretz, is talking about a savak tumah. If it's a savak tumah, then you're only tamei if it's ala oretz, not if it's floating. So that is how the Tanakhama knows it. And there's nowhere in the pasuk where you would see a distinction between something floating in a keli or floating in a puddle on the ground. Rabbi Shimon, what about Rabbi Shimon? My timer, why did he make that distinction that if it's floating in a bucket, that wouldn't be covered, and therefore it would be tamei misafek? Omer Ula Ksiv. Let's look at these psukim inside. Once again, these psukim are not talking at all about any type of tumah sheretz. This pasuk is speaking about the halacha of mikveh, but it's being darshaned. So it says, Ach ma'ayin ubar mikveh ma'im yetar. Pashup Pshat is we're talking about what's matar, right? But we're darshaning that if you touch a sheretz that's in a ma'ayin bar mikveh ma'im, you're going to be it's going to be tar. You're going to be tar. But then it says v'negei b'nevlasam yitma, it'll be tamei. So once again, I'm going to ask you a question: if you touch a sheretz, is it tamei or is it tar? So how do we darshan this inconsistency? Ksivach ma'ayin ksiv yitma haketzad safa b'kelim. If it's floating in kalim, tamei. So b'chol negei b'nevlasam yitma means if it's floating, but it's floating in a keli, that's going to be tamei misafek. There's no special carve out to protect this safek tumah. But the karka tahar, if this tumah was floating in a puddle in the karka, that's where it says achmayin mikveh yatar. Such a safek tumah will be tahar. So now we've learned the basics of tumah tzafah. Basically, it only applies to a safek if you touched it or not. And there's a machlokes if it could be suspended anywhere, or if only if it's suspended in water that's on the ground. That was the machlokes that we had. But there's going to be a lot more details required to be able to tap in to this kula of Suffolk Tuma when it's a floating Tuma. And the Gemara starts with a price. Tanu Rabban. Kol hanitlin v'anigrorin sveikan tamei. Even if it was floating, but if it was being pulled or dragged, so you have a tuma that's floating, but it's being dragged or pulled, that's going to be considered tamei. We don't consider that floating. Why don't we consider that floating? Because they're tethered to a human. They're being dragged or pulled. Therefore, the rule doesn't apply to them. But what if you throw something, now it's floating, that will be Sveikan Tahar. That would be Sveikan Tahar. So let's have a quick look at Tosfos. Kol Nitlin means Adam Oimid B'Mayim, V'Chaverei Haya Mishal Shal Sheretz. I think the change it, but basically, you have a person who's standing in the water and his friend is pulling a sheretz over him. And the question is, the person who's standing in the water, the Suffolk can be touched it. He was pulling a sheretz across the water. Since ultimately there's a hand holding them, a typical example is if someone wants to use a rat for bait, maybe he's fishing for sharks. So he casts it and he winds it in. You have this sheretz floating up in the Amayim, and someone's swimming, and it's a suffix if he touched it or not. That's going to be tamei if it's a rishus hayachid, because it's considered tethered. But if it's in the air, thrown, dislodged, not tethered, then it does have this rule of tzafa. The whole davar, chutz min kezayis min ameis. This heter does not apply to kezayis min ameis. V'hamal al pnei tuma, and someone who is b'tama ba'oil. So what's ma'al al pnei tuma? Kagoin adam ahoylech b'mayim. Somebody is walking in the water. V'nimtza kezayis meis kavua b'mayim, and there was a kezayis min ameis there floating in the water. Sofek over hator alav, the hell alameis. So it's not a question if he touched it; it's a question if he hovered over it. The b'sheretz ki agavna tar. A sheretz would for sure be tar b'chagavna, because we know there's a rule of sheretz by maga. Sheretz is not matama boil, but there's a suffix maga avada, it would be tar. Or b'meis l'tumas maga, or even if it's a question of tumas meis, if it's a question if you touched it, you would also be tar. But mile will not. The kachli taira tzafa, the tuma kavua, kamay tuma tzafa, the taira kavua. It doesn't make a difference if the tuma is floating and what's moving in the water is yourself. So that's why the example that Tosfos gives is the tuma is not moving at all. It's kavua. It might even be lodged to the ground, but you're swimming by. You're not tethered. So now we've learned another halacha about Tumah Tzofa. Tumah Tzofa works to say a suffix is tar, not only if the Tumah is floating, but also if the person or the tahiris that might have touched it, if they're floating, that will also be able to take advantage of this rule. But that only works if the suffix is whether or not the Tumah was touched. But Tumah's oil, that does not have the kula of tumatzah. So we've just learned one exclusion, tumas oil, okay, or really any tamei that only applies to a sheretz. So heset, which is moving something without touching it, that also doesn't apply to a sheretz. So this entire kula of floating tuma wouldn't apply to heset either. And then v'chol davar shemetama milamata kilamata lisur zava. Anything that's matama above like below. What that means is davar shemetama lamalik lamat lisur zava shemetama beheset. A zav is matama beheset by moving things. V'chein el yoyne shel zav v'zava kilamata mimishkavay. We know that there's a famous fairy tale called The Princess and the Pea. Even if the pea is 10 mattresses down, it impacted her back. Well, that comes from a Zav and Zava. If a Zav sits on the bed, even if there's 20 mattresses, the bottom mattress will become just as tummy as the top mattress. So by that tumah, we don't have the kula of tumah tzafa. Im Zav and Zava oivrim b'mayim. So if a Zav and a Zava are oivrim b'mayim, so once again, it's the source of the tumah in this case that's floating. Uchli etzlam, and there's a tar kli near them. Safek hisitoi, and it's a safek if they moved it. Ein lonu litar mishum tumah tzafa. We cannot be mitaher these kalim because the zav and zava were tumah tzafa, because it only applies if there's a shaila if it was touched. Ela b'maga dafka dubi desheretz. V'chein im midrasoi sham. If there's something that someone could sit on, and a zav would create tamei medras, the zav over safek daras again ein l'tar mishum tumah tzafa. Tumah tzafa only applies to tumas maga, which is the type of tumah that a sheretz can transmit. Okay, beautiful. So we learned very important halachas. Boy Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama had a shayla. What would be if mes b'chli tzaf al pnei hamayim? You had a kazayis min hameis in a keli, and the keli was floating on the water. So do we say that this piece of mace is considered floating, and if it's a suffix, I touched it, I'm going to be tar? Or do you say it's not floating, it's in a keli, it's stationary, it's not sitting in water, it's sitting on the bottom of the keli. The keli happens to be floating. So now, basher kli as linon, do you look at the kli that's holding it and that's floating, and therefore this should be considered a floating tumah? I basher misa as linon, you go basher the meat itself, and the meat itself is sitting on the hard bottom of a pail. And now we're going to go through a series of, I think, about 7 or 8 shilas that Rami Chama asks, starting with this first shilah. If you're going to say that you look at the whole thing as a whole, the meat and the keli is one whole, and it's all considered floating, mace al gabi sheretz ma'u. What if the mace was on top of a piece of sheretz, and that was floating on the water? Ma'u, what do? Even the high tumas erev, the high tumas shiva. Do you say that the tumas mace, the mace and the sheretz are foreign materials to one another? So therefore, since they're foreign materials, the foreign material should act like a keli. It should be no different. The mess on the piece of sheretz should be no different than the mess in a bucket. So therefore, do we say that since they're different type of tumas, it's foreign material? Come on, the machsa tumah b'chli dami. It's as if the tumah was in the kli, and therefore, if it was in a kli, then it's not going to have the advantage of floating tumah. Or do you say it's 2 pieces of tumah? So we look at it as one big chunk, and that everything is considered floating, and therefore the kula of tumah tzapa should apply. And if you're going to tell me that sheretz to mace is foreign matter, and we don't look at it like that the mace is floating, rather we look at it like it's sitting on the hard floor made out of sheretz, what would be the halacha? What would be the halacha with sheretz al gab nevela? Sheretz and nevela already have a similar tumah. They're both, you only become tummy for that day. Right? There's no tumah shiva by a sheretz and not by nevela. So maybe sheretz al gab nevela unevela tzafamau. Even the tavar tumas erev inun tumas smichtahi. Do you say that since they're similar in their properties, so we look at it like both of these tumas are floating, and you can go to kula, idilma, these are different tumas with different properties. Because high kazayis, in order for a nevela to be tamei, you need a kazayis, the high bechadosha. And in order, I shouldn't say nevela to be tamei, in order for nevela to transmit tumah, it has to be the shear of a kazayis. But in order for a piece of sheretz to be mitama, it only has to be the size of a hadasha. So once again, they're not parallel. So you shouldn't say they blend together. So then, what would be if it's sheretz al gabe sheretz? You have 2 identical tumas. Would you say that they're all considered one big piece and they're all floating together? Or once again, do you say that the top piece of sheretz is on the ground? Now, Hani vadoi chat shir and inu. These are two exact tumas. They're both shrotzim. Oidilma kiven the mafsakim adadi. Since they're two separate pieces, loy, the top one is not considered to be floating. The imtimtaloimer sheretz al gabi sheretz. Kiven the mafsakim adadi command the macha bechlidami. They are separate. Now we're going to go to another avenue. Up until now, our discussion was: is the bottom item considered connected to the top item, to the tumah, and therefore it's one big thing, or not? Now we're going to look at a case where do you say the bottom item is bottled to the water, and therefore the top item is in the water. So the Gemara wants to know: sheretz al gabi nevela shenimucha. You have dissolved nevela that's sitting in the water. The sheretz is sitting on top of that. Mao, do you say that kiven the nemucha havalei mashke, since the nevela is dissolved, we consider it part of the water, and therefore the sheretz is sitting floating in the water? Or maybe this is not water. This started off as a solid and it dissolved. That doesn't qualify as mashke, and therefore it's considered a separation. And if you're going to say that the fact that it was once a solid makes it into an oichel, and therefore it's not considered like the sheretz is sitting on the water, rather sitting on this piece of nevela that's creating a separation, what would be the halacha of sheretz agabi shich v'zera? Shich v'zera is tamei, but it was always a liquid. It was never a solid. So maybe the shich v'zera would be bottled to the water, and it's as if the piece of nevela is sitting in the water. Where does shich v'zera come out of? It comes out of a body, a solid body. So once again, you consider it a foreign entity, and therefore it's not part of the water. What would be sheretz al gabe mechat? We know the water of a parah aduma makes you tamei. So what if the sheretz was sitting on top of that water? That the water was, I don't know how you could keep the water in the same area. I guess you saw the cloudiness from the ashes in it, so you knew that the sheretz was sitting right above that part of the water. That was always water. It was never an uchla, right? So umechatos tzofan al gabe hamayim, and the mechatos is at the top of the water. Now Zok Gemara, Loshen Nazir Mishuna, Lo Yodinin, we don't know the answer, Teku. So it's an interesting expression of how the Gemara says Teku, Lo Yodinin, we don't know. So just to summarize what we have over here, we learned a big chiddush today. We learned it from Psukim, the halacha of Tumah Tzofa. You have a Sofik Tumah, and you're mesupik, whether or not the thing that was tar, be it you, be it Pruma, be it Tahiris, you don't know if it touched a floating tumah. The halacha is misopik you go l'kula. But that's only if the tumah is right in the water, not separated between other things, as Rabbi Barchama probed, which we don't have a teretz to. And we also learned that this only applies to tumas maga, which is the tumah that applies to shrotzim. It doesn't apply to tumas hesed, nor does it apply to tumas oil. And we also had a machlokes if this applies even if it's floating in a bucket, or only if it's floating in a body of water that's connected directly to the ground. And that takes us to the end of the first half of today's daf, which was a completely new subject of Tumah Tzaf. Do you wonder what would be if it was on ice? I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know the answer. Okay, let's see the Gemara back. Now we're going back to the parsha of Tumas HaTahim. So let's just review exactly how Tumas HaTahim works, so that we'll be able to understand what Rav Hamnuna's comment was. How does Tumas HaTahim save a Nazir? So our Mishnah's case was where the Nazir completely finished his Tahira process, and all he had to do was go into the mikveh. So the Nazir became Tamei, it was Soiser's Nazirs, right? And he had his Hazah on Shlishi Ushvi, and now he's going into the mikveh. The Gemara says if he goes into the mikveh and he was Tamei before he went into the mikveh, he doesn't have the protection of Tumas HaTahim, right? Because he has a Cheskes Tumah. But if the Nazir was not Tamei, and after his Giluach, after he successfully finished his Naziris, someone came and told him that he had 2 weeks ago walked over a Tumas HaTahim, but he was tar at the time. For instance, he went swimming and he was only there in the mikveh because he wanted to go swimming, not because he was tamei. There is the protection of Tumas HaTahim, we say that he's not Tamei. Right? That is the halacha l'Moshe Mishinai of Tumas HaTahim. Make sense? Now, how is the parallel by the Korban Pesach? Korban Pesach would be the same thing. Let's say a fellow was bringing his Korban Pesach and he's all ready to go. And after he finished the Korban Pesach and he has his animal, he's excited to eat it tonight. Someone tells him, hey, 2 weeks ago, you walked over that road. And it turns out there's too much time there. There he's protected. Where is he not protected? If this person who wanted to come bring his Korban Pesach was Tamei, and a week before Erev Pesach, he started the process, he got his Hazah Shlishi, Hazah Shvi, right? And then he went to go to the mikveh, which is the final step of him being Matar. And when he was in the mikveh, they found there was a piece of mace there, right? That's the Mishnah's case. There, Tumas HaTahim will not save him. Right? Tumas HaTahim does not save him when he was in the mikveh because he was Tamei. It only saves him if he was in the mikveh because he was going swimming, because he was tar, right? So it's pretty much parallel Tumas HaTahim by Nazir as it is by the Yosy Pesach. Comes along Rav Hamnuna and tells us such a big chiddush that it can't be true. Amar Rav Hamnuna, Nazir v'Yosy Pesach. These two people, shahalchu bekever HaTahim b'shvi shalahem. They were toiling on day 7. Right? They both had their zrika from the paraduma, and now they're toiling, which is exactly the case of our Mishnah, right? Tahirim, they're tar. My timer, T'loy alima, Tumas HaTahim limista. The Tumas HaTahim will not be able to be soiser. It's a meforshah against the Mishnah. It's black and white. Our Mishnah is black and white, not like this. Masav Rabbah, our Mishnah is black and white, not like this. Yarad litar mitumas hameis, tamei. Shecheskas Tomei, Tomei. Shecheskas Tar. So how could Rav Hamnuna say that since you're on day 7? I'm sure it's day 7, you've already weakened your tumah already, because you've already had your hazahs. So weakened Tomei, that's a tumah that won't be soiser. But our Mishnah Beferish says that if you hadn't toiveled yet, and you were there in the mikveh because you wanted to be betarmi from your tumah, then tumah satan would not save you. So Rav Hamnuna is making a statement that's a direct contradiction to our Mishnah. Amalei Rabbi Mamnuna told Rabbi, what do you think? I was born yesterday. I know the Mishnah. But how do I explain the Mishnah? My dinalach ben Nazir to mechuzar taglachas. The Mishnah is not speaking about Yosy Pesach. Because on Yosy Pesach, since he already had his Rika, and all that's left is the Tefillah, he's protected from Tumas HaTahim. We're speaking about a Nazir who, after the Tefillah, he still has not reset his Naziris. When he became Tamei, he has to get Taglacha. So since he's still premature in his Tahira process, he will not be protected from Tumas HaTahim. So therefore, the Mishnah works out very well like me, and the Mishnah is speaking about a Nazir only, and the Mishnah is speaking about a Nazir who didn't do Taglacha. Amalei Rabba, you know something, Rav Hamnuna? I think you're right. Af anah ma'dunalach. I will agree with you by an Yosy Pesach, there's no action missing. I toivel, right? And there's nothing else missing here. So after I toivel, they came and they told me there's a mess floating around there. I'm done. I did whatever I have to do. There I'm protected from Tumas HaTahim. By Nazir, I didn't do everything I had to do. I still have to do Taglachas. Okay, very good. Amalei Abaye. Abaye said, how could you say that nothing's missing? There's a very integral part of the Tahira process that's missing. From a Chusar Harav Shemesh, we know that the Tumah doesn't completely go away until you wait till the end of the day, until you wait to sundown. Beautiful. Amalei Shimsham Meila Arba. Beautiful, Dr. Moshe. It's nothing that you have to do. It's something that has to happen, and it has to happen, and it always does happen automatically. There's no work that you still have to do. You've done everything that you needed to do to get rid of your tumah. That's enough to get the protection from Tumas HaTahim. Because the fact that you still have to wait, that doesn't mean anything, because that happens by itself. Zok the Gemara, va'af Abaye haderbe. Even Abaye, who at first considered the fact that it's missing Harav Shemesh as a lack of the completion of his Tahira, and therefore he wanted to claim that it should not get the protection of Tumas HaTahim, Abaye was chayzer. Abaye actually holds that something that happens automatically that you don't need to do, that's not considered an equal at all. Where do we know Abaye said this? In a sugya that has nothing whatsoever to do with Tumas HaTahim, nothing whatsoever to do with anything. It's a comment that Abaye happened to have made, like something that has no shaykhs to this, but it shows that he did share Rab's opinion that something that happens automatically, like Harav Shemesh in particular, is not an ikkur. And where did he say it? He said it by Melois, Yoy Melois. So let's first explain what this thing with the Melois. In Parshas Tazria, the Torah tells us that Isha kisas Ria v'yolda zachar v'tama shivas yamim kimei nidas tavois titma. So for 7 days, this woman is tamei mishamnida. On the end of the 7th day, she could toivel, and now she's mutter to be with her husband. She's still also to eat from kachim and to bring her carbon, but she's mutter to be with her husband. Not only is she mutter to be with her husband, no matter if she sees dam, the dam will be dam tahoyar, and it will not answer her to her husband. How many days does she get this pass for a dam tahira? Ushloishim yoim, ushloishim sham. So basically, there's 7 days of tumah, followed by a tefillah, followed by 33 days of yemei tahira, where no matter what dam she sees, it's not metamah her. And then at the end of those 33 days, which is a sum total of 40 days, 33 plus the original 7, she toivels, and then the following day, on day 41, she brings her karbanos as a yoledes, because up until that point, she's not allowed to bring karbanos. By a female child, everything doubles. So she's tummy for 14 days, and then there's a 66-day period of Yemei Tahira, after which she can bring a carbon. So meaning a total of 80 days. We're focusing on a child, a female child that was born, and you'll see shortly why. So we have a woman who, after 14 days, toiveled and went to the mikveh. And she's having relations with her husband. And what happened was she became pregnant. She became pregnant 2 weeks after she had a baby. And she had a miscarriage before the 80 days were up. So now she actually has 2 babies. She had 2 babies. She had 2 births. How many karbanos does she have to bring when her 80 days are up? Does she have to bring 1 korban, or does she have to bring 2 karbanos? The halacha is she only has to bring 1 korban. And the reason why she only has to bring 1 korban is because the korban for her first baby is not triggered until she's able to bring that korban, until day 81, right? And therefore, anything else that happens before her chiyuv to bring her korban is triggered is covered by that 1 korban that she's going to bring. The Tanya, yoy melois tavi. If she gave birth on day 81, if she had her miscarriage on day 81, then she has to bring 2 sets of karbanos. Because as soon as day 81 arrived, she was triggered with a chiyuv to bring karbanos for her first birth. Now, after that was triggered, she has another birth. Surely she has a new chiyuv to bring a new set of karbanos. But toich melois, what happens if she had her miscarriage before the 80 days were up, meaning before she would have been able to bring her karbanos for the first birth, loisavi. Zog to Gemara, yochel, or zog to Brisa, yochel, and this yochel is referring to a more complex case where there were actually 3 births. So the first birth, we know, and before 80 days were up, she had a second birth, right? So we already know that second birth doesn't have to bring another korban. We've already established that. But what if another 65 days pass and she has a third birth? She has a third birth. That third birth is toich melois of the second birth, but it's not toich melois of the first birth, right? Because it's way after the 80 days for the first birth, but it's within 80 days of the second birth. So the question is, does she have to bring a korban for the third birth? Yochel loisavi aleida shalafnei melois. You would think that for a leida that was before the melois, so in this case, the second leida, she wouldn't have to bring a korban for. Avoltavi aleida shalacha melois. But for the third birth, she would have to bring a korban. V'seipater b'shtein. The gears are funny, and she'll need basically two korbanos. one for the first two births and one for the third birth. The only time the chiyuv to bring a carbon is triggered is when the whole Yemei Tahira is finished. So what is the reason for it? Why is it that the third birth does not bring another carbon? It's already past the times of the Malois. Let me ask you a question. If this happened, at what point can she bring her carbon for the first Malois? So look, she had her first baby, then 65 days later she had a second baby, and then 65 days later she had a third baby, right? At what point can she bring her karbanos for the first baby? Can she bring it as soon as she hits the 80-day mark? No, because she's tamei from the second baby, right? So did she ever have a point in time where she was able to bring her carbon? No. So come to Chayis, even the third baby that was born way after the Malois, but it was still born before the chiyuv for her to bring her carbon for the first baby was even triggered. Therefore, we consider it one big carbon. Zok Rav Kahana, shiny hacha, the mechasra carbon. Period. Break the Gemara. Let's go back to what the Brisa said at the beginning. If you had a baby, if she had a miscarriage, toich melois, she doesn't bring a carbon. But if she had an la'acha melois, she brings a second carbon. So let's analyze when did she have this carbon? When did she have this baby? She counted 80 days, right? And let's say she had the baby the afternoon of the 80th day, right? In other words, she lavdavka had it on day 81, maybe she had it on day 80, right? After the Malois, or even on day 81. Correct, Abaye, if she had it on day 81, how could you tell me now she has to bring an extra carbon? The problem is, Hasam Nami Mechasra Harab Shemesh. She doesn't have Harab Shemesh. What does that mean? Zok Toisvis, there's different pshatim in the Rishonim on this, but what Toisvis says is, the Brisa says open-ended. If the baby is born before the Malois, you don't need a second carbon. If it's born after the Malois, you do need to bring a carbon. But it's mashma after the Malois, no matter what, even if she never went to the mikveh. Even if she never went to the mikveh after day 14, which normally the women go to the mikveh, no matter what, if it was even born on day 81, she bring a second carbon. Why? Since she didn't go to the mikveh yet, she's only going to go to the mikveh on day 81, so she wasn't yet royal to bring her carbon for the first birth, because she didn't go to the mikveh. And even if she went to the mikveh, she didn't have Harab Shemesh. So, but she didn't, and she didn't. So Oibazoi, she couldn't bring her carbon yet. So if she couldn't bring her carbon yet, so then when she had the second child, that should be that. I mean, she had a second child before the chiyuv to bring her karbanis for the first child was triggered. That means it's not there. She's not allowed to bring a carbon. It means there's even a shayla of Lila is mechosher shemana or not. But if she cannot bring her carbon, that means she's not yet at a time where she can bring her carbon. So Oibazoi, correct the Gemara, why is it that she has to bring the second carbon? And Tosha says, Omer le Abaye, so Abaye says, Shimsha memela arva. The shemesh happens by itself. So you're looking at me crazy. Forget the shemesh. She's in toivel. Exactly. So how come Abaye is saying since it happened by itself, it's not a consideration, but the mikveh doesn't happen by itself? So Tosha says an interesting twist. The shemesh that she doesn't have control over, that's not a problem because it's going to happen automatically. The mikveh that she has control over, that for sure shouldn't be an ikov, because that she has control over. So she can do it, which is a stick of what you were saying, right? So, but the main point is, this is all a zaytik sugya. All we're trying to illustrate from here is Abaye subscribes to that argument that the fact that there was no Harab Shemesh should not be something that we consider is ma'akiv in the carbon, because it's something that would happen by itself. So even though she's before Harab Shemesh, she's already considered ready to have been able to bring the carbon. And that's all we're trying to prove from there. So just to summarize, we learned now new information about Tumas HaTahaim. We learned that if it's Mechusar Taglachas, that would make it Tomei. But if it's not Mechusar Taglachas, or by a Oisa Pesach, who he already had the spritzing and he toiveled, now he just has to wait for Arab Shemesh, that would protect him from Tumas HaTahaim. If at that point he found out that he was B'tama with Tumas HaTahaim, the Halacha L'Moshe Sinai would protect him. Okay, gewaltig. So we'll stop here, Be'ez Hashem, and we'll be mamshech tomorrow. Shkoyach.